When a reason for captivity no longer comes to mind, when days continue without reminding anyone why they are there, and when the original purpose of confinement quietly fades, what happens to a person when even the meaning of being a prisoner begins to disappear? At first, the reason for captivity still existed somewhere in memory, present as a fact rather than a feeling, recalled when necessary but rarely visited with intention, because daily life no longer required it to be remembered. The men knew they were prisoners, yet this knowledge had begun to float above experience rather than shape it, detached from the routines that now defined their days. What once framed every action as temporary or imposed gradually lost its relevance, as repetition replaced explanation and habit replaced reflection. The camp no longer demanded constant awareness of why it existed, because nothing within it pointed back to the moment of capture or the events that led there. Days unfolded without reference to origin, beginning and ending according to routine rather than reason, allowing the condition of imprisonment to persist without context. The men did not forget the war in a factual sense, but the war no longer entered daily thought with clarity or urgency, existing instead as distant background noise. Without reminders, the cause of captivity drifted further from immediate awareness, becoming something known but not felt, acknowledged but not engaged. The mind adapted by releasing questions that no longer influenced behavior, conserving energy by focusing only on what the present required. Why they were there mattered less than how the day would pass. And how the day would pass had become predictable enough to require no explanation. The men found themselves navigating the camp as though it were a fixed environment rather than a temporary condition, adjusting to its rhythms without referencing its origin. This adjustment did not feel like surrender, because surrender implies awareness of loss, and awareness had softened as the days repeated themselves closely. The absence of struggle removed the need to justify endurance, and without justification, the reason for endurance faded from attention. The men no longer measured time against the expectation of release or resolution, because expectation itself had weakened, leaving the present to exist on its own terms. In this present-focused state, the idea of being held for a reason felt abstract, disconnected from lived experience. Imprisonment became a condition rather than a consequence, something that simply was, without needing to be explained or defended. The men did not feel confused by this shift, because confusion requires contrast, and contrast had been eroded by uniformity. What remained was a quiet normalization of captivity, where fences and routines no longer pointed outward to an external cause, but inward to daily function. The environment ceased to remind them of its purpose, as symbols of control blended into the background and lost their power to provoke thought. Guards, boundaries, and rules existed, yet they no longer carried the same symbolic weight, functioning instead as parts of the environment rather than reminders of confinement. The men noticed that their thoughts rarely returned to the moment of capture or the chain of events that led there, not because these memories were erased, but because they no longer influenced daily survival. Without the need to interpret their condition, interpretation itself faded, leaving experience to proceed without commentary. The reason for being a prisoner no longer structured identity, because identity had already shifted toward endurance and routine rather than cause and consequence. This shift reduced inner conflict, because conflict often arises from questioning circumstances, and questioning had become unnecessary in a world that offered no answers. The men adapted to captivity not by understanding it, but by living within it, allowing the question of why to drift into the background. As days accumulated without reference to origin, the initial shock of capture lost its emotional charge, becoming a distant memory rather than a defining event. The men no longer anchored themselves to the idea that this situation had a beginning tied to specific actions or choices, because such anchoring offered no practical benefit. Instead, they oriented themselves around continuity, learning how to move through each day with minimal friction. The reason for captivity, once central, now felt peripheral, like a story belonging to another time that no longer intersected with the present. This detachment did not feel like denial, because denial requires effort, and effort had already been minimized by adaptation. What emerged was a quiet forgetting, not of facts, but of relevance, where the cause of imprisonment no longer mattered enough to shape thought or feeling. By the end of this phase, the men still knew they were prisoners, yet the meaning of that status had thinned, separated from its original reason, and absorbed into routine, leaving captivity to exist without explanation, and in doing so, beginning a deeper transformation that would continue to unfold. If you'd like to hear future stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel. As a reason for captivity continued to fade from daily awareness, the sense of responsibility that had once been tied to it began to loosen as well. Because responsibility often depends on a clear connection between cause and consequence, and that connection had grown faint. The men still understood, in principle, that they were prisoners of war, yet the moral weight of that status no longer pressed inward with the same force, leaving responsibility suspended without a clear object. Guilt, when it appeared at all, felt distant and abstract, detached from specific actions or events, as though it belonged to a version of the past that no longer intersected with present life. Without a vivid sense of why they were there, the men found it harder to locate themselves within the larger narrative of the conflict, reducing complex histories into something too remote to engage with emotionally. The war itself began to feel less like an ongoing reality and more like a background condition that no longer required attention, allowing the present to operate independently of past decisions or allegiances. This independence softened the sense of personal accountability, because accountability often relies on remembering how one arrived somewhere, and arrival had become an event too distant to influence daily behavior. The men did not feel absolved, but they did feel unburdened, as though the weight of explanation had been set aside without discussion. Responsibility shifted inward, narrowing its focus to immediate conduct rather than broader meaning, concerned less with why they were prisoners and more with how they moved through each day. In this narrowed frame, moral questions lost urgency, because urgency depends on stakes that extend beyond the present, and the present had become self-contained. The men adapted by responding only to what demanded response in the moment, allowing larger questions of cause, fault, and consequence to remain unanswered without discomfort. Belonging also began to change, as identity drifted away from former affiliations tied to the war and toward the immediate group that now shaped daily life. The men felt less defined by who they had been before captivity and more by how they fit within the routines and expectations of the camp. This shift did not feel like betrayal, because betrayal implies awareness of abandonment, and awareness had softened into acceptance of change. The absence of a clear reason for being held allowed the past to lose its hold on present identity, making room for a quieter, less conflicted sense of self. Without the constant reminder of why they were prisoners, the men no longer felt compelled to justify their endurance or explain their position within the conflict. Justification itself felt unnecessary, because nothing in daily life required it, and without requirement, it faded naturally. Responsibility thus became localized, focused on maintaining equilibrium rather than addressing history or consequence. The men found it easier to relate to one another within this localized framework, because shared routine replaced shared cause as the primary bond. This bond felt practical rather than ideological, grounded in presence rather than belief, reducing the emotional charge of belonging. As a result, loyalty shifted subtly from abstract causes to immediate stability, prioritizing continuity within the camp over connection to distant events. The men did not consciously reject their former identities, but those identities no longer demanded attention or allegiance in the absence of reminders. The war receded further into the background, becoming something known rather than something felt, loosening its influence on daily judgment. By the end of this phase, forgetting why they were prisoners had not erased responsibility, but it had relocated it, removing it from history and placing it firmly within the present, where it shaped behavior quietly and efficiently, leaving questions of cause and blame suspended without resolution. As the reason for captivity continued to recede into the background, the idea of freedom began to change as well, because freedom often exists in relation to what confines it, and confinement had grown strangely familiar. The men still understood the concept of freedom, yet it no longer appeared clearly in thought, lacking definition and urgency, as though it belonged to a distant framework that no longer applied to daily experience. Without a strong sense of why they were prisoners, the opposite condition lost clarity, because freedom gains meaning through contrast, and contrast had been softened by routine. The men did not actively think about release, not because it was impossible, but because imagining it required reconnecting with a cause that no longer felt present. Freedom became abstract, reduced to an idea without detail, difficult to picture in practical terms or to attach emotion to. The mind adapted by narrowing its focus further, investing attention in what could be navigated and managed, rather than in what lay beyond immediate reach. In this narrowed focus, freedom no longer functioned as a goal, because goals require direction, and direction had already weakened under the weight of repetition. The men noticed that references to life outside the camp arose less frequently, not out of avoidance, but out of irrelevance, as those references no longer influenced daily decision-making. Without a vivid image of freedom, restraint lost its sharpness, because restraint implies holding back from something desired, and desire had become diffuse. The men did not feel deprived, because deprivation implies awareness of something withheld, and awareness itself had softened as the camp became the primary frame of experience. What replaced longing was a neutral acceptance of limitation, where boundaries existed but no longer demanded emotional response. The absence of yearning reduced inner tension, because yearning stretches the self between present and imagined future, and that stretch had relaxed. Freedom, once imagined as a return or restoration, now appeared vague, lacking form, place, or timing, making it difficult to engage with sincerely. The men found that thinking about freedom no longer energized or unsettled them, but passed through the mind quietly, leaving little trace. This quiet passage signaled a deeper shift, because when freedom no longer provokes reaction, captivity ceases to feel temporary. The camp began to feel like a complete environment rather than an interruption, capable of sustaining life without reference to what lay beyond its boundaries. In this environment, the absence of freedom did not feel like loss, but like a condition that had always existed, normalized through repetition. The men adjusted their sense of possibility accordingly, limiting it to what could occur within the camp rather than beyond it. This limitation felt practical, even calming, because it removed uncertainty and reduced the mental effort required to imagine alternatives. Without the tension between captivity and freedom, experience flattened further, existing entirely within the present structure without pulling forward or backward. The men did not consciously abandon the idea of freedom, but it no longer organized thought or behavior, existing instead as a distant concept disconnected from lived reality. In this state, the idea of release felt less like an event to be anticipated and more like an abstraction that might belong to someone else. Freedom had not been rejected, but it had lost its shape, becoming too indistinct to guide emotion or action. By the end of this phase, the men lived within confinement without measuring it against an imagined outside, allowing captivity to stand on its own terms, and in doing so, revealing how completely the reason for imprisonment, and even its opposite, had slipped from the center of their inner world. As the idea of freedom lost its shape and urgency, the sense of belonging beyond the camp began to loosen as well, because belonging depends on connection, and connection requires active remembrance of where one fits. The men still knew there was an outside world, yet that world no longer felt immediately related to who they were becoming, existing more as a distant reference than as a place of return. Without a clear reason for captivity, the boundary between inside and outside softened, not physically, but psychologically, making the camp feel less like an interruption and more like a complete setting. The men noticed that memories of home surfaced less often, not because they were painful, but because they no longer influenced daily survival or decision-making. Belonging, once anchored to places, people, and roles beyond the wire, began to shift inward, attaching itself to the routines and relationships that now defined everyday life. This shift did not feel like abandonment, because abandonment implies a conscious turning away, and here there was none, only a gradual reorientation toward what was immediately present. The outside world grew abstract, losing texture and specificity, as names, locations, and familiar patterns faded into general impressions rather than lived realities. The men found it harder to imagine themselves resuming former roles, not because those roles were rejected, but because imagining them required effort that no longer felt necessary. Identity adapted by narrowing its scope, aligning itself with the environment that demanded attention rather than with one that no longer did. In this narrowed identity, references to who they had been before captivity felt less personal, belonging to a version of a self that had existed under different conditions. The men did not grieve this change openly, because grief requires recognition of loss, and recognition had softened under the steady continuity of camp life. What replaced grief was a quiet distancing, a sense that the outside world was becoming less familiar without becoming hostile or forbidden. The camp provided enough structure and predictability to sustain this distancing, offering a stable frame that reduced the need to look beyond it. Relationships within the camp deepened subtly, not through intimacy, but through shared presence, reinforcing a sense of belonging that did not require explanation. The men began to measure themselves less against past identities and more against how smoothly they fit within current expectations. This measurement felt practical rather than ideological, focused on continuity and ease rather than aspiration or return. The outside world no longer served as a reference point for self-understanding, because reference points require relevance, and relevance had shifted inward. Even thoughts of eventual release felt disconnected from identity, as though release would occur to someone else, a future self not yet imagined. The men adapted to this separation by living more fully within the boundaries of the camp, allowing belonging to settle where it was reinforced daily. This adaptation reduced inner tension, because divided belonging creates strain, and strain had been replaced by acceptance of present conditions. The idea of home became less a destination and more a concept, something acknowledged but no longer felt as a pull on the present. By the end of this phase, the men still recognized that an outside world existed, yet their sense of belonging had shifted decisively inward, rooted in routine, shared experience, and the quiet familiarity of captivity, leaving the world beyond the wire distant, undefined, and increasingly unrelated to who they were becoming. As belonging settled inward and the outside world grew distant, captivity itself began to exist without reference, sustained not by cause or explanation, but by continuity and habit. The men no longer needed to remember why they were held in order to understand how to live, because living had reorganized itself entirely around what was present and repeatable. Imprisonment ceased to feel like a response to past actions and became instead a setting, a stable environment that no longer pointed backward to events that had led there. The absence of reason did not weaken the structure of captivity, because structure had already been absorbed into routine, functioning independently of memory or justification. The men moved through the camp without questioning its legitimacy, not because they accepted it intellectually, but because legitimacy had become irrelevant to daily function. Rules, boundaries, and limitations remained in place, yet they no longer invited reflection on their origin, operating instead as features of the environment like weather or terrain. In this state, captivity did not feel imposed moment by moment, because imposition requires awareness of force, and awareness had softened under repetition. The men experienced themselves less as prisoners and more as inhabitants of a closed world, adjusting to its rhythms without needing to recall why those rhythms existed. This adjustment did not feel like forgetting in a conscious sense, because conscious forgetting requires effort, and effort had already been minimized by adaptation. What occurred was a deeper fading of relevance, with a reason for being a prisoner no longer intersected with identity, choice, or expectation. The men did not feel relieved by this fading, nor did they feel troubled, existing instead within a neutral state where meaning had narrowed to what could be managed. Captivity no longer carried a narrative, because narrative depends on origin and outcome, and both had drifted beyond the boundaries of attention. Without narrative, the condition of being held felt complete, requiring no explanation to sustain itself. The men continued to recognize fences and guards as facts, yet these facts no longer pointed toward injustice, conflict, or resolution, but simply marked the limits of the environment. In this environment, the idea of being imprisoned lost its emotional charge, becoming descriptive rather than defining. The absence of a remembered cause removed the tension between endurance and hope, allowing the present to exist without pulling toward an imagined end. Time passed without being measured against release or judgment, further reinforcing the sense that captivity existed on its own terms. The men adapted fully to this condition, not by understanding it, but by inhabiting it, allowing life to continue without asking why it had taken this shape. By this point, forgetting why they were prisoners had not erased the fact of captivity, but it had transformed its meaning, turning it from a consequence into a condition. Captivity no longer needed justification, explanation, or memory to persist, because it had been internalized as the normal frame of existence. By the end of this phase, the men still lived behind the wire, yet the reason for being there had faded so completely from daily experience that imprisonment itself no longer required a cause, existing quietly as the world they now inhabited, complete, self-contained, and unquestioned. In the end, nothing erased the facts of captivity, and nothing changed the fences or the rules that remained in place. What changed was quieter than that, because the reason for being held no longer entered the day, no longer shaped thought, and no longer asked to be remembered. Life continued without reference to origin or cause, sustained by routine rather than meaning. and carried forward by repetition rather than expectation. And so imprisonment did not end, but its reason dissolved, leaving behind a condition that no longer needed explanation in order to continue. For more untold World War II stories like this, subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault and continue the journey with us.